Welcome to the story of the Tudors, a tale of ambition, blood, betrayal, and brilliance that reshaped a kingdom and echoed through centuries. Our story begins not with peace, but with pandemonium, a time when the English crown was less a symbol of order and more a cursed relic passed from head to bleeding head. It is the 15th century. England is weary. A century of plagues, famines, and the 100 Years' War has left the land brittle. And now, its very heart, the monarchy, is up for grabs, has turned in on itself. The House of Lancaster and the House of York, both descendants of Edward III, now face each other across a battlefield of paranoia and ambition. This is a war not just of swords, but of symbols. The white rose of York, the red rose of Lancaster, and beneath their petals lies England, bleeding. In this war, loyalty is a coin quickly spent. Betrayal is as common as bread, and the line between hero and villain as thin as a blade. Welcome to the Wars of the Roses. In the twilight of England's medieval dream, two branches of one royal tree tangled their roots in ambition and scheme. The House of Lancaster, red as wrath, and York, white as winter's path. Both sons of Edward, both proud, both bold, both hungry for England's glittering gold. It begins, as these things often do, with too many heirs and not enough chairs. Edward III, a mighty warrior king, left behind a legacy of conquest and a tangle of sons. From these branches sprouted rival claims, and from those claims the kingdom's ruin. Edward's grandson, Richard II, ruled with pomp and poetry, but lost the throne to Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, a usurpation masked as salvation. But such things echo. The Lancastrian crown was never quite secure. Henry V, warrior of Agincourt, brought glory, briefly, but his death passed the throne to an infant son, and that son, Henry VI, brought the kingdom not triumph, but trembling. Crowned a baby, ruled as a ghost. He spoke softly, prayed often, and trusted too much. A king more suited to cloisters than councils, more monk than monarch. To his court, he brought not justice, but silence. While his mind wandered, power gathered in darker corners. England under Henry became a kingdom without a captain. Nobles schemed, factions grew, and the realm split along old scars. And where there's a vacuum, ambition rushes in. Enter Margaret, Queen, French, formidable. She was no passive consort. She led armies, forged alliances, and dared to rule where her husband could not. To some, she was a heroine. To others, a she-wolf. But none could doubt her fire. Opposing her, Richard, Duke of York, great-grandson of Edward III, seasoned soldier, tireless agitator. He claimed he wanted reform, but with enough support, reform often looks suspiciously like ambition. York's ambition grew with England's silence. Twice he ruled as protector, when Henry's crown slipped into shadow and the kingdom begged for order. At first, he spoke of loyalty, of duty, of reform, but power borrowed breeds hunger. And York, great-grandson of a king, saw not just a realm in crisis, but a crown within reach. He claimed descent more rightful than the king's own son, and when Parliament met in fear and fracture, he forced their hand. An act of accord, bold, unnatural, naming York heir and disinheriting the prince. But Margaret would not yield. She fled north, calling banners and vengeance. The red rose gathered thorns, and York rode out to meet the storm. Yet he was not alone in ambition. Behind him stood a shadow with a sword. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, Master of Calais. scourge of the Channel, a noble with coin, command, and cunning. He raised fleets, forged pacts, turned piracy into popularity, and draped himself in the cause of York. To the people, he was their champion. To his foes, a whispering storm. Together they struck at Northampton, tore down the gates, and took the king. And York, emboldened, reached for the crown. But it was Warwick who held the streets. Then came winter and Wakefield. York rode north to break the Queen's defence, but found not a fight, a slaughter. Outnumbered, surrounded, York fell, his son beside him. Warwick held London, but York's line now looked to another, a younger lion, fierce and unbroken. The father was gone, the king unmade, but the storm had only just begun. And in the storm's eye stood Warwick, no longer just a noble, but a force, the puppet master, the rainmaker, the man who could raise kings with a whisper and ruin them with a nod. He played politics like a bard plays lute, deftly and often for coin. Old grudges flared, family feuds turned fatal. What began as whispers in court became roars on battlefields. The kingdom had cracked, and as blades were drawn, the roses were picked, not for gardens, but for war. A nation divided, not by border or creed, but by bloodlines and banners and galloping greed. The seeds of ruin, long ago sown, now bloomed in steel and moaned in stone. The storm was here, and it would rage for decades. England bleeds from civil war. Two royal houses, York and Lancaster, tear the realm apart. Skirmishes grow into pitched battles. As the young Edward of York rises to avenge his father, the Lancastrian cause rallies behind the seasoned Duke of Somerset, and all eyes turn to Towton, where the fate of the crown will be decided in blood. 1461. The snow fell sideways, the wind howled like a curse, and on the fields of Towton, the blood of England turned the snow to slush. They say 20,000 died that day, perhaps more. Brother slew brother. Neighbours carved each other into legend. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, where sons were cut down before their father's eye. Out of the red-stained snow rose Edward of York, tall, charismatic, ruthless, the first king in years with iron in his spine. His court dazzled. His rule promised order. England, exhausted by strife, might finally breathe. But behind every golden throne lies a man who helped lift it and expects it back in kind. The kingmaker, having given away the crown, now found himself wanting to wear its shadow. Warwick, once the maker of kings, now uneasy. He had made Edward king, but Edward was no puppet. Then came the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, a widow, a woman with ambition in her smile. To Warwick, she was an insult. To the nobles, a threat. The new Queen's family rose swiftly, too swiftly. Brothers, uncles, cousins, given lands, titles, power. The court, once a circle of steel, now swirled with Woodville silk. The old guard gritted their teeth. And so, the alliances twisted again. Warwick and Margaret, former enemies, now shared a table and a plan. The red rose had not wilted. It merely waited. And now, with Warwick's hand, it would rise again. They struck swiftly. In 1470, Warwick and Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville, rebelled. Richard, too, would later marry Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter and the widow of Prince Edward of Lancaster. These marriages were not unions of love, but the cunning cobwebs of Warwick the Kingmaker, or rather the lineage maker, who sought to bind York and Lancaster into the palm of his hand. The realm quaked again. Edward IV was forced to flee across the Channel, unseated, exiled, and hunted like a stag through winter woods. For a brief moment, the old king returned. Henry VI, feeble and bewildered, was lifted from the shadows of the tower and crowned once more. A hollow crown for a hollow king. It was called the readeption, but it was no restoration. Behind the throne stood Warwick, draped in velvet, holding the strings. Yet triumph tastes bitter when shared. Warwick's uneasy alliance with Margaret of Anjou trembled. She returned from exile with her son, Prince Edward, and her own fire. The Kingmaker had summoned a queen, but she had not come to kneel. In the spring of 1471, Edward returned. He landed in Yorkshire with little more than faith and the wind. But momentum is a strange thing. It clings to the bold. Lords rallied to him. Old loyalties flared like torches in the dark. Then, another turn. George, Duke of Clarence, ever the political weather vane, sensed which way the breeze blew. He abandoned Warwick and the Lancastrian dream, crawling back to Edward in a grand performance of brotherly repentance. His betrayal shattered the fragile alliance. Warwick's house of cards began to fall. By Edward's side rode his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, loyal, quiet, fierce. Where Clarence schemed, Richard stood. He had bled beside Edward in exile and would become his iron right hand. At just 18, Richard commanded men in battle with a coldness born not of cruelty, but of duty. At Barnet, beneath a fog that swallowed flags and blurred faces, York met York. Confusion reigned. The mist turned friend to foe. Lancastrian soldiers struck down their own. The Earl of Oxford's men, mistaken for enemies, fell to friendly blades. What should have been coordination became catastrophe. Warwick, the Kingmaker, died in the chaos, not on a throne, but in a butcher's cart. Richard was there, leading the charge through the haze, steel drawn, and then the final reckoning. At Tewkesbury, Edward crushed the last hope of Lancaster. Prince Edward of Lancaster, Margaret's only son, was cut down before her eyes. Margaret herself was taken, and that same night, Henry VI died in the Tower. Some said of grief. Others whispered Edward's hand. But Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was there, and silence has its own voice. With Lancaster's blood washed from the field, Edward IV ruled unchallenged. England exhaled. But breath does not mean peace. Peace returned, but trust did not. At court, old wounds festered behind silken smiles. Clarence, that ever-restless brother, chafed again. Whispers turned to accusations. In 1478, he was executed. Drowned, they say, in a butt of Malmsey wine. A toast to ambition. And its end. The Woodvilles flourished. Queen Elizabeth bore the king many children, seeds for a golden age. But the roots tangled. Her family grew in power. Brothers, uncles, cousins, rising like ivy on palace walls. The old nobility watched with clenched jaws. Richard, forged in war and tempered in silence, was made Lord of the North. A title reserved for those who could be trusted with the edge of a kingdom. While the court simmered in London, He kept the peace in the borderlands, against Scots, against bandits, against the memory of rebellion. He ruled with discipline, feared, respected, alone. Edward, once a lion, grew heavier, slower. Years of pleasure dulled his edge, and then, in 1483, at just 40, death came quietly, and everything he had built began to tremble. The crown passed to his son, Edward V. But in England, crowns are never passed. They are taken and rarely kept. After decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and shifting allegiances, the Wars of the Roses were nearing their end. But the final chapter would unfold not with the triumph of either the House of York or Lancaster, but with the rise of a dynasty no one had expected. This is the story of how, in the aftermath of Edward IV's death, the crown passed through shadows, secrets, and slaughter, and ultimately landed in the hands of a Tudor. In 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly. Power in England was never taken politely. His son, Edward V, was named king at just 12 years old, too young to rule alone. His trusted brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stood at the heart of Yorkist power. Known as the Lord of the North, Richard governed the vast northern territories with firm justice and military skill. Through the most turbulent years of Edward IV's reign, he remained unwaveringly loyal. Even in moments of danger and discord, a quiet reverse of their other brother, George, Duke of Clarence, whose ambition and treachery had brought chaos and disgrace. It was Richard who eliminated the Kingmaker, the powerful Earl of Warwick, his own father-in-law, on the battlefield at Barnet. And when Edward needed someone to sort out the throne once and for all, it was Richard who dealt decisively with the last Lancastrian king, Henry VI, within the Tower. Yet even as Richard stood firm beside the crown, many of the old nobility grumbled behind closed doors. They resented the sudden rise of the Woodvilles, Elizabeth's family of common birth, whose influence at court had grown swiftly and, to some, uncomfortably. Richard stepped forward, first as Lord Protector, then as something more. He questioned the legitimacy of the boy king, claimed Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Their children, bastards, Parliament agreed, or rather was made to. And so, by common assent, it was declared that the said children were not of lawful matrimony. Titulus Regius, 1483. Before the crown could even be warmed, Richard moved. He arrested the Queen's kin, took control of the young king, promised to care for the realm. Some called it lawful, others a coup dressed in robes. But the pace was dazzling. The boys vanished. The crown gleamed, and Richard stepped forward, not as protector, but as king. The princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were lodged in the Tower. For safety, it was said. The children were seen playing less and less until they were not seen at all. Croyland Chronicle, 1483. And then, silence. No funeral, no farewell. Just a void where heirs had stood. Weeks later, Richard declared them illegitimate. Parliament ratified it, and Richard was crowned king. To some, he was a usurper. To others, a necessary hand in chaos. To many, he was something darker. Many men murmur it that the children be destroyed. Surely, it is a heavy reckoning. Dominic Mancini, Italian observer in England, 1483. But across the sea, another waited. A name almost forgotten. Henry Tudor, a threadbare claim, a cautious hope, hidden in exile since childhood. Son of Margaret Beaufort, herself descended from Edward III, 5 generations back. Between Edward III and Henry Tudor stood nearly a century and a long line of kings. Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Edward IV, and briefly Edward V. Margaret's claim came through John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford, whose children were born out of wedlock and only later legitimised. A claim through bastards made legitimate. Thin blood perhaps, but in England's hunger for stability, even mist becomes a crown. He studied, he waited, he learned not just to fight, but to endure. In courts, in storms, in silence. Despite his distant lineage and uncertain legitimacy, Henry prepared with quiet determination. He knew the odds were long, but in a fractured kingdom hungry for order, even an outsider with resolve could become a contender. He studied England's wounds, its fears, its craving for a steady hand, and dared to believe that he, of all people, could offer it. Then, as the nobles whispered of princes lost and kings without heirs, Henry moved. With French gold, Welsh steel, and English desperation, he crossed the sea not as a conqueror, but as a gamble, a pretender, a prayer, a storm with a crown in its eye. August 22nd, 1485. Bosworth Field. 2 armies meet, one led by a king, Richard III, the other by a man many called a pretender, Henry Tudor. The sun rose on uncertainty. Henry's forces were outnumbered, but war is not won by numbers alone. Richard placed his fate in steel and loyalty, Henry in strategy and hope. And one man stood between them, Lord Thomas Stanley, father-in-law to Henry, nominally loyal to Richard, but silent, watching. The Lord Stanley came not to the field with King Richard, but stood still with his company. Hall's Chronicle, 1548. When the tide began to turn, Richard did what few kings dared. He rode straight into the heart of the fray, sword drawn, banner high, toward Henry himself. It was bold, it was brilliant, it was doomed. Stanley, watching all, chose his moment and chose his side. Richard died with his sword in hand, crying, they say, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. But no horse came, no rescue, no mercy. King Richard alone was slain fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. Virgil's. And so, after swords clashed and loyalties crumbled, the crown was lifted from the blood-soaked earth one final time, not for a Plantagenet, but for a new name. After 3 decades of carnage, betrayal, and dynastic roulette, this, at last, was the moment England's crown ceased to roll and began to reign. A dynasty forged not in inheritance, but in resolve, that would rule England for 118 years, an echo through history like no other. The Tudors. For over 30 years, England had fought itself. Cousin against cousin, lord against lord, king against king. What was left behind was not just a trail of graves, but a people desperate for peace. Henry VII was no golden boy of destiny. He was cautious, calculating, cold, some would say. But in caution, there was survival. In calculation, stability. To end the war, he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of his enemy. 2 rival houses joined in one flower, the Tudor rose. The emblem combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, a carefully crafted symbol of reconciliation. It was not just a badge, it was a message, a signal that the chaos was over and a new age of unity had begun. a symbol of unity, of strategy, and above all, of survival. The Tudors would bring peace, but also paranoia, splendor, and suspicion. It was not a fairy tale. It was a throne built on caution and held by will. Next time, we follow this new king, Henry VII, as he walks the knife's edge between power and rebellion, order and unrest. The war may be over, but peace is never easy.